What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and I'm here today to talk about the best decks in Ixalan Standard. After a particularly important first weekend of legality, there were not one, not two, but three really important tournaments over the weekend, and that gives us a pretty good database from which to draw information here about what decks are good and what decks aren't. So, after this first weekend, I think that some cream definitely rose to the top, so let's talk about these decks. Well, Ixalan Standard started off with an SCG Open, an SCG Classic, and an MTG Online Pro Tour Qualifier, all pretty important tournaments, and a pretty good sample size from which to draw here. And if we're starting with sort of the most dominant deck first, then I think that deck's definitely got to be 4-color Energy. Cleaned house over the weekend. Now, we're talking about 3 different top 8s today. That's essentially 24 decks that we'll cover in some capacity or another. And 4-color Energy takes up 7 of those slots. Easily the most dominant deck over the weekend. And it's essentially the same teamer deck that we've seen for a while now, with a couple of twists. Well, gang's all here still. We've got Rogue Refiner, Long Tusk Cub, Whirler Virtuoso. You can count on these guys showing up in a Teamer Energy list. And honestly, Rogue Refiner and Long Tusk Cub deserve to be mentioned on a list of the most important cards over the weekend. Again, we're sort of covering 24 decks here, and both of these guys are in nearly half of those lists. Saw a lot of energy strategies over the weekend, so these guys ended up being really, really relevant cards. But the biggest addition of this deck, and the thing that made it in 4 colors most of the time, was the Scarab God, which we saw 2 of in a lot of these Teamer Energy lists. That makes it 4 colors, and Teamer Energy has been experimenting with this for a while, but it seemed like over the weekend it became definitely the norm to play the 4-color Energy list with Scarab God instead of the Teamer list that we're more accustomed to. Now, the deck that won the MTGO PTQ played 1 copy of Hostage Taker. A lot of 4-color Energy decks did not play him, at least in the main board. But this deck that won the MTGO PTQ at least played the 1 copy in the main. And I want to point that out because Hostage Taker is a card that we'll see a good bit today, too. There's a Sultai Energy deck that we'll also cover today that usually played, in most cases, a playset of Hostage Taker. This is probably the most important new card from Ixalan over the weekend, and it skyrocketed to $15 from $5 in just a couple of days. That's how important this card is, and a lot of people are saying it's the hottest card in Ixalan. Not the last time we'll see it in this video, but I want to go ahead and point it out, especially since the winning list played it. The deck still plays Bristling Hydra and Glorybringer. It's mostly looking to play like the best cards in its color, and these are definitely examples of that. Glorybringer is another creature that can have immediate value the turn it hits the board. That's what a good mid-range deck is looking for, and it's 5 drops, and this is the quintessential mid-range deck in the format. It's going to play Glorybringer, and as far as Bristling Hydra goes, it's just really, really tough to deal with in a format with relatively few answers for a creature like it. But even though a lot of these lists did look very similar, there was some degree of variance in them. Some decks didn't play Glorybringer, although again, very, very often you'd see the 2 of main deck Glorybringer. Some played 2 Chandra, some played 1 Chandra, some played no Chandra, but most often you'd see a 1 or 2 of in there. And then a couple of lists even sandwiched in Verderous Gearhulk in the deck, which was not something you'd see often, but was something that came up a couple of times. So these lists weren't extremely high variance, but there was some notable variance in the way people chose to play the strategy. Moving on from the first weekend and sort of looking towards the Pro Tour, I definitely think that this is the deck to beat. It's one of those decks that just plays all of the best cards that it can play. Those decks tend to do well in competitive Magic, and it still has a bunch of synergy. That's the hallmark of a really good standard deck. It's got energy synergies that it can fall back on and rely on, and it's also got a really high amount of amazing cards that are just super powerful on their face. You know what I mean? So this is the kind of deck that doesn't come along super often. Really powerful cards and really powerful synergies. So I think this is going to be a really tough deck to beat going forward, and it's one of the premier decks in the format. We'll definitely put it in the S tier because people are going to be looking for answers for it, but there's not a whole lot of specific answers for it. We're not just going to start playing Solemnity and call it a day because it's just not that simple. Now, 4-color Energy may have taken up 7 out of 24 slots. That's pretty impressive, but there was a deck hot on its heels, an old rival, Ramunap Red. This deck is still around, and it took up 6 slots out of that top 24. Now, it's worth noting that there's really not much worth noting about Ramunap Red. It hasn't changed that much. Lightning Strike is the most notable addition to the deck, and it's definitely the card that the deck wanted. If the deck listed one card that it wanted, then Lightning Bolt would probably be the number one thing. So, closest thing they can get is Lightning Strike. If it has the chance of going to the Dome with its burn, that's much better for it in the long run because that provides reach against slower decks, which there are. We're a mid-range format in a way, and there's even control decks in this format that we have to worry about. And in those cases, going to the Dome is really, really desirable for an aggro deck, provides it a lot of reach and makes it even faster. Now, the formula remains more or less unchanged. You've got your Earthshaker Kendras, your On-Crap Crashers, and your Hazoret the Fervent. Those are your three heavy hitters for the most part. There are definitely other creatures in the deck, but those are the ones the deck is most focused around curving out into. And especially Hazoret the Fervent, more or less the card that the deck is centered around more than any other, and it's the card that a lot of people were trying to answer over the weekend. I think that it is worth noting that Ramunap Red didn't actually finish first in any of these tournaments, even though it did have, 6 top 8 finishes among 3 tournaments. That's a very noteworthy finish in the first weekend, but didn't actually win any of these tournaments, and I think that's because a lot of people were gunning for Ramunap Red, and it's much easier to plan for a strategy like Red than it is a strategy like Energy, for instance, especially when they've given us new cards like Vraska's Contempt, which did show up over the weekend to deal with cards like Hazoret. That said, some people did experiment with the formula just a little bit. We saw a 3-of Rigging Runner in one top 8 list. That was interesting. I'm not really sure how much the deck wants to play a 3 of this, but most lists didn't play it at all. There were some lists outside of the top 8 in all 3 of these tournaments that experimented with Runner, but for the most part, the list that did the best didn't play it. Only one snuck into a top 8. And then one of these lists, in fact, one of the Ramunap Red lists that did the best, snuck in one copy of Rampaging Ferocidon, which I think is actually a really, really good idea. We may see over time as Ramunap Red begins to adjust to this format, we may see more or less Ferocidon in the main board. We usually see them in the sideboard, from what we can tell in Ixalan Standard. But I think that a 1 or 2 of main deck is definitely an important consideration, especially moving forward. That's mostly because having Ferocidon as an option game 1 will increase our already good matchup against a control deck that has a chance of stabilizing if they can play their mainstay card. I'll talk about that deck in just a moment, but Ferocidon may be really important for, hosing that deck if that deck gets more popular as it begins to adjust. And moving forward, and again, with an eye towards the Pro Tour, I think that's exactly what Ramunap Red needs to do, is attempt to adjust. If anything, I think the deck might need to get a step faster. It did lose some 1-drops, and a lot of people didn't think that'd be a great idea, especially when we can add Lightning Strike. But at the same time, I think that experimenting with more 1-drops like Rigging Runner might be ultimately the right idea. The deck's going to have to be faster than Energy builds. If Energy can get to the mid-game turns and start stabilizing and turning the corner, then there's really not much that you can do as an aggro deck against that. So aggro may have to get just a half step faster if they're going to keep pace, even with a card like Hazoret. And that's because there are plenty of answers to Hazoret. That's the thing about aggro right now, is that there are kind of a lot of answers for it, and it's going to have to find a way to adjust for that. But even if there are a lot of answers for it, it's still finishing at least somewhat reliably well. So who knows if we can actually keep the Red Menace down, but, I think it's at least possible that it still remains a really important deck. And right now, I think it's in the S tier just because of its first weekend performance. Now, the third deck I want to talk about today managed 4 top 8 wins over the weekend. Between 3 tournaments, that's not that bad at all, right? And it actually took first place at the Star City Games Open. That's impressive, too. We're going to talk about Sultai Energy for a second. This is a really neat deck. Now, it's called Sultai Energy, but don't let the name fool you. This is in a lot of ways a Winding Constrictor deck from the last standard that's been modified to add blue. It's got Winding Constrictor, it's got Walking Ballista, and it's got Rishgar Pima Renegade. These are all all-stars in the Snake deck, but it combines that with an energy theme. We see Long Tusk Cub and Rogue Refiner, again, those cards becoming very important, and also Glint Sleeve Siphoner as a creature in the main deck to help us draw cards. So we're mixing strategies here, but that works really well, obviously, because the Snake gives us extra energy, and anything that can get a +1/+1 counter like Long Tusk Cub gets much better with the Snake. We've seen these strategies before, but there was definitely a reason to add blue beyond just Rogue Refiner, which is obviously good in the deck. But the major reason was the Scarab God and Hostage Taker. Now, I only briefly mentioned the Scarab God when I talked about 4-color energy because I wanted to save that whole spiel for Sultai energy, a deck that I think he's just as effective, if not more effective in, mostly because of Hostage Taker. But Scarab God is probably, I talked about a list of the best cards over the weekend, Scarab God is probably #1 on that list. He appeared in the Sultai energy list in the main board, he appeared in the 4-color lists in the sideboard most often, but sometimes a one-of in the main board, and he appeared in other lists. He's in like 15 different decks out of the 24 decks that we'll talk about today, and he's skyrocketed to nearly $40 over the weekend. He's like $37 or $38 right now on TCG Player, an unbelievable amount of money, but he was that important over the weekend. He's in an awful lot of lists, and that's for a reason. Now, not only is he awesome with all of our little energy guys and stuff like Rogue Refiner too, but he's really crazy with Hostage Taker, which again was the probably most important card from Ixalan over the first weekend here. I love that these are on color with one another. That means that they should go in the same deck, right? You know, and Scarab God can just keep getting back Hostage Taker if they manage to deal with Hostage Taker. And Taker can just sometimes generate straight up like 3-for-1s. You know, you get a guy, take away their dude, and eventually you might get their guy. That's a virtual 3-for-1. And a card like that is obviously extremely powerful, especially if you can get it back, even if they can manage to deal with it. So Hostage Taker is crazy, especially in conjunction with the Scarab God. This is a ridiculous engine. In fact, I'll go ahead and say it. If I had to sleeve up one of these decks that I'll talk about today, it's probably Sultai Energy. I love the overall synergy between the cards. I love that we've got the snake theme going. I've always liked Winding Constrictor decks. I love energy decks, you know, and Winding Constrictor only makes those better. I love Scarab God, and I absolutely love what we're doing with Hostage Taker. Not only in this list, but in Standard in general. This is just such an obviously powerful creature that will help define the Standard format moving forward, I think. So this looks like a very, very powerful list that can do nothing but adjust as things move forward. And on that note, I think that's exactly what the deck will do best, you know. What exactly does this list look like? I don't think we actually know yet because it's a relatively fresh concoction. It mostly takes some of the best elements of Teamer Energy and ports them over into a green-black snake deck. I like the idea, but the list probably looks like it could use some rogue refining jokes, but still, you know, I think this deck has nowhere to go from up, and it has some extremely powerful and obvious interactions in it. So again, if I had to sleeve up 75 cards for F&M and I had an unlimited amount of money, I would probably pick this deck. It looks like a lot of fun, and it just looks like it's got all the synergy ever and just extremely powerful cards. The next deck I want to talk about is a control deck. You don't usually see those in week 1 of a standard environment, but Blue-White Approach actually managed to get 3 top 8 wins over the weekend. Now, this is a deck that people worked really hard on over the preseason. This was a much-hyped deck in the first couple of weeks of brewing season, and it turned out to be a real deck, you know. Our main win condition is obviously Approach of the Second Sun. Nothing's changed there, but Getting of the Trials got added, and Getting of the Trials is a pretty good alternate win condition that can also just help you stay in the game until you can fire off that second approach. And the deck also moved Torrential Gearhulk to the sideboard. Now, that was done universally in an effort to blank our opponent's removal, including a Braid especially. If we just don't have any targets that their removal can hit, that's going to leave them with a bunch of dead cards they can't do anything with, and that's best for control. So a lot of these lists have in fact stopped playing Torrential Gearhulk in the main deck altogether, and mostly their main win condition is Approach of the Second Sun. Now, this list got a little bit of help from Ixalan, at least a little bit more than some of the other lists we'll look at. Some of these decks played Opt, a lot of them played Opt. And a lot of them played Settle the Wreckage. That was a key card in this deck over the weekend. Settle the Wreckage can deal with an awful lot of stuff, even if we only ramp our opponent, you know, 2-3 lands sometimes, especially in the Ramunap Red matchup. That can be perfectly fine. They'll be out of cards by then. A couple of lands won't matter. And really, their curve doesn't go above 4 anyway, so why do we care? So Settle the Wreckage really settled the argument over the weekend. Wrath to Exile, turns out, actually is a very, very effective sweeper, and we'll probably continue to see play throughout the season. It's notable that this list also plays some number of Fumigate, and mostly the numbers have not been determined yet, how many Settle the Wreckage you play versus how many Fumigate you play, but both cards showed up in every single list to some extent, whether you're playing a 4 of mass removal or you're playing a 6 of mass removal. Again, the numbers were definitely not consistent between decks, but everyone has pretty much decided that you play some number of both cards, so I think that's worth pointing out. And another good thing to point out, I think, is the presence of Ether Meltdown in a good number number of these blue-white lists. Just a fantastic card that's often overlooked. Very good removal. That also keeps them from doing graveyard shenanigans and stuff. That's kind of important in this format, where the Scarab God is one of the most important cards. Now, as good as I think blue-white approach is and can be, I think right now it occupies sort of the very top of the A or B tier, depending on whether or not you think S tier is really a thing. I think that it's definitely top of the second tier of decks, but there's a whole lot of other decks that occupy either the mid or bottom of the second tier right now, and we'll use the rest of the video to talk about those, starting with Esper God-Pharaoh's Gift, which did manage 2 top 8 finishes over the weekend, but they're kind of very different decks in some ways. Both decks still stick to the basic core. We've got God-Pharaoh's Gift and Gate to the Afterlife. Obviously, those cards are the backbone of the deck. But it's still got the best creatures to play, too, like Angel of Invention, Champion of Wits. Those are more or less no-brainers. It, too, adds Hostage Taker. Both decks did. This is the most obvious reason to add black to the deck, and it's a great reason, just like bringing it back with the Scarab God. Bringing a Hostage Taker back with a God-Pharaoh's Gift is also an extremely powerful play. So it plays all those cards, but that's where things depart a little bit, and I think that's just proof that we don't know the quote-unquote right build of this deck, and at time present, there are multiple builds you can be successful with. I think that one thing that's cool, Brandon DeCandio's list, he played Seeker Squire, of all things, which actually looks like a really cool card in a God-Pharaoh's Gift deck. It gets a little big, trades on blocks, sometimes it can draw you a card in the form of a land, get some card filtering for you, and then it can come back and do that again as a 4-4 or sometimes even a 5-5. Seeker Squire looks like a really, really good call for this deck. Doesn't look like much, but it's probably pretty awesome, And DeCandio's deck also went with the Minister of Inquiries package that we sometimes see, but it also added Vona, Butcher of Nagam. We didn't see that in the second deck that was Esper God-Pharaoh's Gift. So some really interesting additions to the deck. And, by the way, I should mention both decks also played Chart a Course in some capacity. Really interesting Ixalan card to add to the list, and obviously makes a lot of sense, too. I think the most noteworthy thing about DeCandio's list, though, is that he doesn't play Refurbish in his list, which is a mainstay in these decks. You're just trying to usually discard a God-Pharaoh's Gift. In this case, it's something like Chart a Course in the early game, and then get it back with the Refurbish much earlier than you're supposed to have it. But he didn't even bother with that in this deck, so it's a pretty crazy list, but obviously it worked out very well for him. Moving forward, I think that God-Pharaoh's Gift is mostly kept in check by a lot of different sideboard cards, we'll say, but I don't think that it's dead yet. A lot of people expected it to be DOA now that we've got another graveyard hate card in something like Sentinel Totem, but really people didn't find a whole lot of sideboard slots for Sentinel Totem over the weekend. God-Pharaoh's Gift is still very much a deck, and as a matter of fact, I don't think people found a whole lot of sideboard slots for stuff like Crook of Condemnation or Scavenger Grounds. I think that people were much more worried about other strategies, and that allowed Esper God-Pharaoh's Gift to sort of sneak in there. And honestly, it's got a lot of really good synergies, really good interactions. Hostage Taker is just the nuts, so I'm not surprised to see it here. But whether or not it continues to be a successful deck is kind of a matter of whether or not people take it seriously enough to really devote sideboard slots to it. I'm not sure that it's reached that point yet, so it will probably still top 8 every once in a while. Now, another deck that I'm going to put sort of at the middle of the B tier here is Grixis Improvised, even though it actually won first place in its event. That's right, Grixis Improvised won the SCG Classic. Pretty impressive in a lot of ways, but we really don't have a whole lot of sample data to go from, Really, the player playing it was kind of the only player playing it for the most part. We saw random Grixis Improvised decks that didn't do anywhere near as well as the winning list, but it's still there, so I do think that just because it got a first place finish, it's definitely a deck that a lot more people are going to sort of have eyes towards, so it's a deck that we need to look out for and analyze a little bit. And it looks like a really fun and very effective list. I don't want it to seem like I'm discounting how good this deck is, because it's got a lot of really good cards in it. It, too, plays a 1-of Scarab God in the main deck, as well as Tezzeret the Schemer, a card that's really just been waiting its turn to be an impactful card, and now may be its time. It's also got Maverick Thopterus, Pia Nalar. These are just cards that have just been good the whole time they've been in Standard, and are in niche lists a lot of the time, but definitely have a ton of potential. They live up to it in this list. Contraband Kingpin being in the list is just really awesome in every way, Big butt blockers are always good, and provides a lot of value over the course of a game. I like that. And then Herald of Anguish being in this list is really sweet. I think Herald of Anguish is an amazing creature right now. I already talked about that in my Sleepers video. I think Herald of Anguish did get better in this format, and this helps go a long way to prove that. You know, Herald of Anguish is just a huge flyer that's incredibly tough for a lot of the removal in the format to deal with, and it can take a game over by itself and is good against multiple kinds of decks. And this deck is probably the deck that plays Herald of Anguish the easiest. So that may go a long way towards the deck's success, especially when it's packing a full playset of Herald. Now, the backbone of this list still kind of looks like the Grixis Colossus decks that we saw last season, just no Colossus. It's kind of funny, you know. It still plays things like Renegade Map and Prophetic Prism in the early game. It plays upwards of 20 cards that are either artifacts or are capable of generating artifacts, like Pianalar and Maverick Thopterist. But this one plays at least slightly toolboxy in its artifact strategy. You know, it's got one Ether Sphere Harvester, it's got one Servo Schematic, it's got one Sorcerer's Spyglass to have that as a main board option against certain decks, you know. And then its, you know, sort of defensive package is pretty familiar. You know, it's got Fatal Push, Metallic Rebuke in there as defensive options. So this is in a lot of ways like the Grixis Colossus deck. It's just shifted its focus a little bit to win with Herald of Anguish and the Scarab God. But is it a one-hit wonder? That's really the question here, you know. Moving forward, it all depends, again, whether or not people take it seriously. You know, this is a kind of list that can just pop up in a top 8 and no one's prepared for it, you know. And at this point, with only one top 8 finish, even though it's a first place finish, I don't know that it's the kind of list that people are going to pull their hair out over when it comes to producing their sideboard. You know what I mean? I just think that there's probably other things we need to worry about, Sultai and 4-color energy being big considerations right now. So at the end of the day, if you're devoting like 6 sideboard slots to aggro, 5 sideboard slots to the energy matchup, like, at that point, how many do you really have left to focus on this specific weird matchup with the Grixis improvised deck? That's one reason I think it might be a real deck moving forward, and if it gains some popularity, people are going to have to worry about it more. But for now, it's just kind of a weird niche deck that does what it does very well and has creatures that people are going to kind of have a hard time dealing with. Herald of Anguish is seriously no joke. So I think that this deck definitely has an awful lot of promise and will be a more of a slow snowball than the sort of relevance of some of these other decks that I'm talking about. Now, the last deck that top-8'd over the weekend was the Grixis Control deck that took 3rd place in the Star City Games Classic. So I want to talk about that one for a bit. A lot of people expected Blue-White Control, but not everyone expected Grixis Control. And don't get me wrong, some people like this deck, definitely. You're going to be in the comments section, I'm sure. But the vast majority of high-level players were much higher on the Blue-White Approach deck than they were a Blue-Red or Grixis-based control deck going into the first weekend. Whether or not this deck still remains a thing is completely up to sort of how it can adjust. Again, it's a control deck. That's what they do best. But let's look at the list and see what it's got going for it right now. Yet another list that plays the Scarab God, I want to point that out, really got around over the weekend. It's in an awful lot of lists, well over half of the top 24 from the first, 3 tournaments. It's in a lot of lists. And this one does play Torrential Gearhulk in the main deck, all 4 of them as a matter of fact, because it's just got way more instants that are relevant to play out of its graveyard than the blue-white deck does. It also doesn't have a ridiculous win condition like Approach of the Second Sons. I mean ridiculous as in that card is good, and ridiculous as in actually ridiculous. It's just a silly card. But it wins. I can't knock it too much. But this deck is trying to win a little bit more traditionally. And I love the combination of the Scarab God and Torrential Gearhulk. That seems really, really scary. Now, the most notable addition from Ixalan for this deck is Vraska's Contempt, which it played all 4 copies of. It needs this in the aggro matchup an awful lot, mostly against Hazoret, but other problem creatures, and it gains you some life back in that matchup. But it's just not bad in any matchup. I also think it's worth noting here that the deck plays Glimmer of Genius, but doesn't play either Opt or Hieroglyphic Illumination. A lot of people are sort of having the debate over those 2 cards right now, because if you want Torrential Gearhulk in the main deck, you usually want Hieroglyphic Illumination to be the card that's backing it up. It's just a much better card to cast out of your graveyard than something like Opt would be. But if you're not playing it in your main deck, Torrential Gearhulk, that is, then Opt looks like the much better card, because it's just much better for filtering in the early game and finding what you need. But this deck plays all 4 Torrential Gearhulk, and ends up it doesn't play Opt or Hieroglyphic Illumination. I think that's kind of bold, especially considering the deck doesn't have a whole lot of card draw as compared to the blue-white decks. Last thing I'll say about this deck, even though I haven't really talked about land bases this video, is that this deck plays 30 lands. It's just, I think I should at least point that out. Most control decks will play like 26, and occasionally you'll see 27 lands, but 30 lands is crazy, especially in a deck that's Grixis but doesn't even play Nicol Bolas. It's, you're not trying to get to, an 8-drop or anything in this deck, and you're not trying to fix your mana in such a way as to get to a card like Nicol Bolas, so we saw Grixis decks try to get to Bolas and play 28 lands, but I have not seen a control deck with 30 lands in it in a very, very long time. Literally half of this deck is lands. That's insane. That's all I want to say. Again, moving forward, adjustment is key here, and control does that well, but I'm not sure that Grixis right now has the tools to do that in this format. I really like Vraska's Contempt. I think we'll figure out control between blue-white control and Grixis control and the blue-red decks that people are, diehards are still hanging on to. I think that we will figure out control in the next few weeks of this format, especially once we get to the Pro Tour. I would imagine we'll see a control deck that's figured out how to really answer the other decks in this format. Right now, we're seeing a conglomeration of control, which, by the way, I think is good news for control players, especially this early in the format. We're seeing this much control. That probably means that there's a 3 or some, maybe even 4-color control deck that can dominate this standard. We just have to sort of unlock it first. But those aren't all the decks that I want to at least bring up in this video. I won't go in depth about the rest of these decks here, but I at least want to bring up that there are other decks within the top 32s and sometimes top 64s of these tournaments that I at least think could break through, Like, for instance, there was a deck in the top 16 of one of these tournaments, black-white tokens, that used Anointed Procession and other tokens, things that produce tokens, more or less, Looked like a really fun and effective deck and actually top 16 to tournament. And in the NTGO PTQ, there were 2 decks that were essentially black-white tokens that splashed green for Vraska. That seemed like a really, really cool list too, and might have some promise to it moving forward, so I don't want to just leave that one out of the discussion. And there were other cool decks, man. A green-white Cats deck, top 32 in one of these tournaments. Imagine that. That's crazy. A mono-black aggro deck pulled off a top 32. And, of all things, a freaking white-green vampires deck. White-green vampires. What? That's just unbelievable. It was able to top 64 one of these tournaments. That's just... White-green vampires? So there's an awful lot of flexibility in this format. And even just between, the 2 or 3 tiers that we have of, best decks in the format, there's a lot of variance, There's at least 7 decks that I think can top 8 any tournament this weekend right now. And that's pretty awesome. Really 8 if you count the tokens deck, which I definitely think has a lot of promise. Not only that, but Green-Red Dinosaurs did a thing over the weekend. I think it came in 45th or something like that in one of these tournaments. It's definitely the most well-represented Ixalan tribe. And if it can adjust and not just play creatures on curve, then it can probably continue to do a thing in this format. But right now, synergies like Energy are just way, way too focused and strong, and some of the best stuff against them is rotated, So right now we're looking at a format full of energy strategies for the most part, and control decks that can deal with the cards in those strategies. We're also got some aggro in the format, Ramunap Red, mostly, that's really, really fast and just tries to go underneath strategies like control or energy mid-range. So we've got a pretty defined format that even has some stuff like graveyard shenanigans and improvised tricks. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in the standard right now. I think we're diverse, and I think there's a lot of room to grow until the Pro Tour. There's a lot of stuff to experiment with until then. And if you want full lists for any of these decks, I'll have the tournament results for all 3 of these tournaments in the description box. Make sure you click on those. And for some of these weirder decks like white-green vampires, mono-black aggro, I don't think they're going to get a whole lot of sunshine, so I'm going to make sure that I include specific links to them in the description. So make sure you check the description box. There's going to be a wealth of information there this time. But I'm tapped out for now. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of sort of the first weekend of Ixalan Standard, what we're truly looking at. Some of the decks that came out of nowhere, like Grixis Improvised, was really, really cool. Esper God-Pharaoh's Gift has been brewing for a while, but I think it surprised some people. And even Sultai Energy, I think, was a deck that people expected 4-color Energy to be a better deck than, but I think that ultimately it's probably got the higher ceiling than 4-color Energy. I think that Sultai Energy is definitely going places. So there were a lot of decks that sort of surprised people over the weekend. And again, I think we're in a really diverse standard. So we're looking up for the next year here. But in case you disagree with that sentiment, you can always post a comment down there in the comments section. Let me know how you feel. We can get a discussion going, a debate, whatever you want to call it. I think that there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about in the standard, if nothing else. So make sure you post a comment down there. And if you feel like it, you can like the video because that makes me feel better. You can also sub if you're new so you can get the coverage like this and all the crazy deck techs that are coming up, because we're getting into some really fun stuff coming up here soon. So sub, hit the bell if you haven't done all that stuff yet. You can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or if you really feel like it, you can throw me $1 over on Patreon, patreon.com/SBMTG. And remember to check out my sponsor, TCG Player. All of the deck lists in the description that you can click on here will take you straight over to TCG Player. And from there, you can not only view the deck list, but outright buy some of the cards you need for the decks if you're interested in building them. So check them out. Just clicking these links helps out my channel, and you want to help me out, so do that stuff. In any case, I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards.